Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll take just a moment here to let everyone in, and then we'll get started. Okay, looks like our numbers are stabilizing here. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to our webinar where we will be learning about drug checking as a harm reduction strategy for unregulated drug use in the context of Canadian music festivals. Parachute is pleased to present this webinar in collaboration with the Canadian Association of Poison Centers and Clinical Toxicology and the Toxicovigilance Canada Public Outreach and Communication Working Group. Before we begin today's webinar, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which Parachute is located. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, this land is still the home to many Indigenous peoples, and we are grateful to have this opportunity to work on the land. While we meet today on a virtual platform, we encourage you all to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we all call home. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to start us off with some housekeeping items for today. Firstly, this webinar will be recorded, and a link to view the recording will be shared with you. The recording will be available on Parachute's YouTube channel as well. We will also have time for questions at the end of the webinar. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. We will also have folks monitoring the chat for any technical issues. At the end of the webinar, when you're leaving, you will be prompted to complete a short evaluation. It won't take more than a couple minutes. Your feedback is valuable to us and helps guide future learning opportunities, so please do take a moment to do that evaluation on your way out. I'm excited to introduce our speakers for today's webinar, Antoine Marcheterre and Jared Assen. Antoine is currently employed as the drug checking lead for Interior Health in BC. Having been involved with drug checking since 2011, Antoine has experience in community roles, as well as leading service expansion by piloting new technologies, methods, and service delivery models. With a college background in psychology and a Bachelor of Science in Architecture, Antoine brings a unique and passionate perspective to drug checking through a social equity lens. Jared Assen is a licensed pharmacist living in Victoria, BC, having completed his studies in his hometown at the University of Saskatchewan. In 2018, Jared received Canada's first Section 56 exemption for drug checking purposes through his initiative, Lantern Services. This work and his work with the University of Victoria was acknowledged by the BC Pharmacy Association's Excellence in Patient Care Award in 2021. Jared is a co-author of the Drug Resource and Education Project Manual on Drug Checking, with a focus on Chapter 3, Technologies and Procedures. During summer months, Jared works to provide drug checking services at electronic music festivals across BC and is passionate about bringing nuanced conversations surrounding drugs and substance use. Thank you so much, Antoine and Jared, for joining us today to present your work in drug checking, and I will pass to you now to begin your presentation.
Hi, just gonna share my screen here real quick.
Perfect. Thanks, Antoine.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, Sarah. So I just want to start by saying that Jared and I are both really grateful to be able to present to this group here, who I believe will be very diverse. Some people in the group, I recognize some names here, so might know a lot about drug checking already. This will be hopefully a good introduction for those who are new to the subject. And there will be a 20-minute period of questions right after, so looking forward to that as well. This is a kind of combination of two presentations. One is a report that we did for the 2022 edition of drug checking. at music festivals in the interior of BC. So that means Shambhala and Base Coast. And then the rest of the presentation is kind of like explaining what drug checking at festival means and why it happens. So I would just like to say first, thank you to Anchors, BC's British Columbia Center of Substance Use and Interior Health, as they are both like the three partners that put together the drug checking that happens at the festivals, and Lantern Services, which is Jared's pharmacy drug checking project, and the DREAD project, Drug Resource Education Project, which is a online manual on drug checking of all forms. All right, so drug checking happens at festivals, and it's the work of many, many people that come together from all over Canada and even beyond. So just want to take time to just say that the reason that we're able to talk about all of this is because of a lot of volunteers that gather together every year, sometimes over 70 of them, as we can see here at Shambhala, and 25 at Base Coast. These people actually come from all walks of life, people who use drugs, social workers, activists, pharmacists, chemists, nurses, programmers, doctors, drug nerds, and other many passionate individuals. So it's really the diversity of this team that represents the wealth of knowledge that we can share with people who use our services at festivals. All right,
Awesome.
pass it over to Jared.
Cool. Thanks, Antoine. Yeah, so we'll kind of just talk a little briefly about the historical context of drug checking. So, it began a long time ago, more so in like the 1960s, kind of emerged in the form we can relate to today. And typically it was by us, for us, by by drug users and peers, protecting their community. And largely it emerged in kind of the rave scene and events and party context. So people using colorimetric reagent tests to help confirm identity of substances. And then in the early 2010s, fentanyl started spreading through the opioid market, and it made drugs much more unpredictable and dangerous, leading to overdose and death. And it kind of catalyzed a bit of the drug checking interest. So in 2016 was when the opioid crisis was officially declared here in British Columbia, and drug checking began to gain more interest at a community level. And in 2017, the first FTIR, which we'll define later, was used in Canada for drug checking. And it kind of gave birth to the model that is used quite ubiquitously today. And to present, drug checking is expanding throughout Canada and beyond at kind of a rapid rate. So we'll kind of touch on that as well. So also just wanted to give a little bit of the basis of drug checking. So from a public health context, drug checking constitutes practical ideology centered around individual freedom of choice. So, it's always kind of coming up against prohibition. So prohibition can be considered a breach of fundamental human rights. This work is a response to the harm created by centuries of regulation that have ignored human nature and science. So the TLDR, too long, didn't read. People will do drugs, whatever the hell we do. So we're just trying to encourage people can do it safely and in a way that doesn't hurt themselves. We're reducing the harm, but we're also maybe increasing the benefit that people can get from substance use. So it's a bit of a nuanced approach here. And then, if we go to a map of Canada, we'll see, it began early, pre-2018, there was some groups starting like Anchors, notably. We're kind of beginning, and then as it grows, you can see centered in BC for the most part, and then just by the time the gold stars are health authorities getting involved in different groups, and it's just quite cool to see. I'm sure you'll notice some of these. We'll just kind of speed through. They deserve a lot of interest and pause for them, but we don't have time for that. But you can really see in the timeline on the right that it's really been popping up, especially in 2023. So that's good. And then for the context of this talk, we'll be talking about interior health, which is in BC in the interior, the purple section on the right. And specifically, the two music festivals we're talking about is Base Coast and Shambhala, which is, as we said, the two largest electronic music festivals. So that's where our data will come from, and that's what we'll be speaking on. And some of the legal landscape we'll just briefly touch on because, drugs are illegal, but there has been some changes. So Just to briefly touch, there's been federal exemptions that you can get from Health Canada, the Section 56 exemptions, and it's since been delegated to provinces. So provinces can have the authority to designate urgent public health needs sites, or UPH&S exemptions. And these UPH&S exemptions have been leveraged a lot, especially in BC, to allow for a distributed model of drug checking, which allows for collection, transport, and storage of drugs for drug checking. So it's just kind of eased the legal burden on sites to do the work. So that's great.
Okay, so before we actually move into the drug checking aspects at festivals, what's really a drug, like what's really an electronic music festival? So there are places of artistic expression, places that encourage personal expression, exploration, gathering with friends, like-minded people, camping, group dynamics, usually outside, sharing spaces, building community, a lot of what we could call hedonism and abundance. And really, they are massive multi-day parties. So if anybody in the audience never been to these places, they are high energy. There's music, lights, you're under the weather, you're outside. Interactions are, everything is taken to the maximum degree of intensity that you can think it could, and then even further. So there are very stimulating places where the grounds for experimenting is very potent. We're going to try to share a video here, just not all of it, but just so that you get an idea of what it looks
Coming
like.
back to Shambhala this year, being out here in the mountains on the farm,
So this is
it
what
feels
Shambhala
special.
looks like.
It just feels like I walked into another world.
Anyone that has never been here before, words cannot describe this place.
Something I've never experienced.
There's family here. I'm just so happy. I just wanted to cry. We're back moving in the right direction. Everything's gonna be okay. It's like coming home.
It's been a little minute, but
Coming back to Shambhala this year, being out.
All right, so hopefully that was a good introduction to what festivals can look like. It's just a little overview, but as you can see, it's pretty intense. Well, why would somebody want to use drugs there, right? Like, what would be the reason? Well, maybe they want to feel more connected with others, staying awake, dancing longer. These festivals last many days, experiencing new sensations, curiosity, trying new things, coping with depression, increasing music appreciation, increased libido, addictions, changing one's mind state, spiritual reasons, dealing with anxiety, sleeping. So you take drugs to stay awake, take drugs to sleep, peer pressure. They want to feel like they're part of it. Just the idea that I'm trying to say here is that the reasons that people use drugs at festivals don't really differ from the reasons that people will normally use drugs outside of festivals. So drug use is prevalent there, yes, a lot more than actually outside of a festival if you take a general population, but there are so many reasons why people would choose to use drugs there. Now, what is in these substances? Well, this is a bit of an exercise in drug checking. If we look at these substances, can we actually tell what's in them? Well, the first one was expected to be MDMA. It's actually eutylone, a catenone stimulant that is relatively new and unknown in its effects. This one's supposed to be a Percocet, so 5 milligrams oxycodone with Tylenol, actually is a fake one, so it has fentanyl. And the other Tesla tablet there was found on the ground. And if the person would have taken it, well, they would have had a pretty strong trip because 2CB is a potent psychedelic. So that's why we need drug checking, is because we can't know what is in a drug just by looking at it. And these were all examples that were found at Shambhala. So yeah, drug checking in essence is a harm reduction service that enables people to know what's in their drugs. So somebody brings their drugs to us and we analyze the composition using different tools. And then we discuss the results with the person and point them to harm reduction ideas and services that they could use, whether they choose to use the drug or not. They're all available there. And hopefully what we share with them will empower them to maybe take safer choices. But I just want to say that this is not, we're never pushing something with drug checking. We're just offering knowledge. And lastly, just to note, what drug checking is not, is it's not a standalone service, so it can't be just drug checking. It has to be paired with other harm reduction services. It also is not a tool of surveillance, so it's not to bust people from using drugs, for example, and it's not a solution to the overdose and toxic drug supply crisis. It's just a band-aid amongst others, and it's just something that we can do to try to help with the tragedy that's going on.
All right, so we'll talk a bit about the technology and disclaim them a bit, because there's a variety of different technologies that are used, but we'll focus on the ones that we use at our festivals here. So there are three main techs. So the first one is the immunoassay strip test. So these ones are, they just test a certain analyte of interest. Typically, there's fentanyl strip tests and benzodiazepine strip tests. They're very highly sensitive, so they are more sensitive than the other techniques, including the spectrometer for, let's say, identifying fentanyl if it's there. But they only test for that specifically, and they're binary in the results, so it's simply a yes or a no. But we do run fentanyl strip tests on every sample that comes through service. So yeah, it stands the best chance of identifying fentanyl if it's there. And then we run an airlick reagent test. So this is a liquid test. And then there's a chemical dissolved in solution there that will react with the certain parts of the chemical molecule. So in the case of airlick, if there's an indole group present, it'll turn purple. So this is useful when testing LSD. So we drop some airlick reagent on a slice of the blotter paper, and it'll turn purple over time. And that's how we can rule in that LSD is most likely the drug that's present on the blotter paper. And that's what we do.
Jared,
Yeah.
why would we use that for LSD and not the FTIR?
Yeah, good question. So LSD is very low amount, like it's in the microgram amount. So the concentration's very low for one, and it's on blotter paper, which is like a piece of paper. And running that on the spectrometer, it just doesn't stand a chance of identifying the active ingredient. And running an extraction is not as good use of time on the spectrometer. So yeah, Ehrlich is used because we do test, as we'll see, hundreds and thousands of samples. And then we have the FTIR. So that's Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. So this technique is quick, non-destructive, and relatively accurate. So it's great at confirming major ingredients, bulk ingredients, and major cuts. It can also, it's limited detections, about 5%. So it can't identify every little tiny detail. In a perfect world in drug checking, we have a technology that gives you a readout of everything. And you can say, oh, it's 5% this, 2% that, 80% this. But we work with what we have. So the limitation with spectroscopy, again, is that 5% limited detection, but it can give proportional estimates on quantities. So if we're testing a tablet or something, we can sometimes identify the active ingredient as well as the cut or the diluent, like a starch. So it's quite good. And it's the workhorse of drug checking in many places. So these are the three technologies we'll use, and just wanted to disclaim it in the sense of the data when we go through it and we present on it. Just keep in mind, this is where the information's coming from. So it's not a perfect readout of what's in there, but we work with the technology we have. Antoine, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that's good. Yeah, just like you said, it's the reason why we use that is that it's relatively easy to learn, to use. So it can be used by non-chemists, for example. Also, it's very quick. You can get a reading of a sample in under 3 or 4 minutes, and it's non-destructive. So the sample can actually be given back to the service user. I will stop sharing now so that we can share a video of what it looks like inside of our drug checking tent.
I'll just talk over this video. We did a video tour of the drug checking tent. So we have the safer use supplies there, info table, people can ask questions. So here's the different booths that we have the instruments and technician and harm reduction worker paired at. So we have about 5 stations running for many hours a day, and there's big lineups and running through all the samples there. So that's a little bit of a context. So you can see the mobile laboratory we kind of worked from. That was specifically at Shambhala.
All right, so we're finally ready to get into the report. So this is the results of the drug checking service in 2022 that we're going to go through in the next slides. There will be a lot of data. It's good to remind ourselves of the disclaimer that was explained by Jared. All this data was obtained by using these methods. So yeah, there are limitations to it, but we'll try to make sure that we make note of them while going through. All right. So if you want to follow along or just keep this report later for your own interest, there will be data that we won't actually go really deep into. So there should be a link in the chat by now, or you can scan your phone there and you can take the report with you. Okay. Now, it's just important to know that the results in this come from drug checking. So drug checking at festivals looks at drugs that voluntarily come to our service. Because of our testing capacities and the need for testing or not, we do not really look at legal substances, right? So we don't look at like, well, that's not the legal one, but we don't look at cannabis and we don't look at alcohol. So just that to say that drug checking results do not look at actual drug consumption in festivals fully. We know that people use a lot of alcohol, cannabis, and mushrooms, but we don't have any data on them. So we really look at the drugs that we can actually analyze. Okay, so when we're looking at both festivals together, we have around 25,000 attendees. In 2022, we tested 3,868 samples. Just anecdotally, I can say that I've started going through the data for this year, and we are up 20% to 4,580 samples. So quite a big jump from 2022 to 2023. The services usually have a long lineup. People wait upwards of 2 hours to actually attend the services, so it's very popular. We served over 2,000 people, but that doesn't mean it's only 2,000 people that got our results, because oftentimes people comes in groups of 3 or more to access the services. Okay, so we sorted the drugs into categories. So those are all the drugs that we identified through our spectroscopy, plus the results from our Ehrlich reagent. So we divided them in classes to make it a little bit more easy to understand. What we can get from this graph here is that the classes of drugs are actually pretty varied in what people choose to bring to the service. So it means that people are looking at different experiences. You'll have a psychedelic and a dissociative, an empathogen and a stimulant. A lot of people use different drugs from these classes throughout the festival. So the 6 most common drugs that we see, by far the most common one is MDMA. And then just dropping down, it's ketamine. After that, we got cocaine, LSD, MDA, and 2CB. So MDMA is an empathogen. It's a drug that people take. It makes them feel like they, it makes people that take it feel like they have more connection with music and people around them, maybe more energy to dance. Ketamine is usually taken a little bit to get a sense of drunkenness, but in a different way. But you can compare its use a little bit more like somebody who would use alcohol, but in higher doses, it does get psychedelic. Cocaine is a stimulant I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. It has a pretty short duration, is usually consumed multiple times through the same night. LSD is a longer trip. People do tend to use smaller amounts of LSD, we noticed, because the environment is definitely overwhelming, but there are some people who like the psychedelic experience there. And MDA is a psychedelic empathogen, and 2CB is another psychedelic. So I'm just sharing this screen. It's a bit overwhelming, but it's all the other drugs that we identified. So just that to say that actually most of the drugs are the main 6 that we showed, but there are more drugs that people bring. A lot of those actually people bring on purpose. They do plan to use these drugs that are all sorts of alphabets that I'm not going to get into right now. But sometimes these weird names come as a replacement of the drug that the person decided that they wanted to use. So let's say somebody buys MDMA. Well, it's possible they get a benzylpiperazine. And that's why drug checking can help you know what's in there. Okay. And just before going further along, just to pointing to the limits of drug checking, it's important to say that, yes, like we have very expensive, fancy equipment, lots of effort put forward analyzing drugs. But there are so many factors that actually influence substance effects and outcomes of use, right? So it could be dose, intentions, setting. So setting here being a festival, but like, who are you with at the festival? Like, is it raining? Have you slept in the past 5 days, right? So have you had previous experience with the drugs, or are you planning on combining with other drugs? How much do you weigh? Like, what is your age? What is your sex? What is your body chemistry? Are you taking prescription medications? Is there anything in the drug that we're not detecting that might actually affect your outcome? So the reason I'm saying that is that, yes, we analyze substances, but it's people who use them. The drugs just exist, but they wouldn't really do much if they weren't put inside a human body and the people report on their effects. So it's just something to keep in mind with the drug checking results, that it's not the end of all. And many people can have different reactions to different drugs. Okay.
Nice. Yes. Yeah, drugs be complicated, and so are people. And together, oh boy. So we'll talk about drugs. What are they really? So Antoine went through the kind of the top 6 most common drugs we analyze at festivals. So before we kind of go forward with some more of the nitty-gritties on specific substances and categories, we'll just kind of define a bit what an active or inactive ingredient is. So an active ingredient is the substance that has the noticeable effect. So psychoactive physiological effect. They can be illicit drugs, or they can be buffs or cuts that are in there. They can be expected or unexpected, but they're the ones with the effects. And then there's the inactive ingredients. So these are substances that don't have a significant or noticeable effect in the body or mind. So they don't have physiological effects, psychoactive effects. They are used to sometimes bulk up the substance as a cut to increase the amount that's in there without actually adding the active ingredient. Or sometimes they're used to dilute a substance that's too strong on its own. So that can be the case of opioids cut with caffeine, but that's not the focus here. And then there's also inactive diluents. So this is something we'll see. So that can be a carbohydrate or sugar. Typically, that's kind of the binder for tablets. And some examples of those are microcrystalline cellulose, sucrose, glucose, different sugars, blah, blah, blah. You can read there. So there's different things that kind of come up. And not every active ingredients are what we're typically most interested in. But we will identify active diluents as well. Okay, so now we'll define some colors in our nice little bar charts here. So the gray color you'll see is only the expected active substance was detected. The green is the expected active was detected as well as an inactive ingredient. And then the yellow contains the expected active substance and one or more active substance. And then the red is there's not the active substance that people were expecting, and then there is another active or something else in there. So we'll kind of break it down by category here. So starting with MDMA, so you can see approximately precisely 80% of substances checked at these festivals only contained MDMA. But there was noticeable amounts of others kind of ingredients in there as well. So that's for MDMA.
Just for correction, Jared.
Yeah.
80% of the MDMA that was brought into the drug checking tested as just MDMA, not 80% of the drugs that were brought tested as MDMA.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that's back on our disclaimer there. So we're just presenting on the data that drugs that come into service to get tested. It's not fully representative. And then with ketamine, so almost 90% of ketamine samples are a single ingredient of ketamine. And there's cocaine. So interestingly, with cocaine, this comes to a surprise of many, is that it's not always cut, it's not always filled with other stuff, but it was testing as cocaine as a single ingredient, as far as we could tell, with the limitations of our technology and databases. And then there was LSD. So LSD, again, we're testing with Ehrlich reagent. So it's a binary yes or no, but vast majority was turning purple in the Ehrlich. So high likelihood it does contain LSD. And we have MDA. So this one's noticeably lower. So about half the time it was MDA as expected. And then another larger chunk was not as expected. So we'll touch into what that implies. And then with 2CB, so you can see maybe 60% of the time was 2CB as a single ingredient. And the noticeable green chunk there, about a quarter of the time, had another inactive. And this is attributable because 2CB is found as tablets a lot of the time. So that's just an inactive diluent making up that large chunk.
Okay, so we're just going to break this down real quick. This is a bit much information to just get into just for this webinar here. But what we're really doing with this chart is looking at the colored portions of the bar chart that Jared just described. So just breaking it down for MDMA, we can see that there is the 7% that probably meant that it was either sugar that was cut with the powder, or it was a tablet that just had something like cellulose to just bind the tablet together. But then the next bars, we show that there is a bit of variability into what is brought in the drug checking service as MDMA and comes out to be something else. So there's quite a few like alphabets of drugs here. And then one that's notable actually is an example here that happened. One MDMA sample was actually down, which is an opioid mixture containing fentanyl and benzodiazepines, caffeine and sugars. This is pretty much the best example that we can share how drug checking can probably save a life. If the person would have used that, and we actually asked this person, like, hey, like, do you actually use opioids in life? And they're like, no, like, I've never, like, ever used an opioid in my life. So just using this sample that actually looked like MDMA and consuming the amount that you would take for an MDMA experience, it would probably be very quick to put you down. So yeah, this actually was a great example here. Now we do have MDA. So MDA is a bit of an interesting one because it really gets mixed up with MDMA all the time. Just so I explained the differences between both. So MDMA is a bit less potent than MDA. It lasts about maybe 5 to 6 hours and is mostly an empathogen, meaning that it enhances your feeling of connectedness with others and the world around you. MDA is a bit more stimulating and psychedelic, so you'll have more like visual effects, and you'll feel a bit more of a racing heartbeat and energy to do things. A bit more confusion as well, and it lasts longer, like upwards of 8 hours, and the dose is about like maybe 60% of what an MDMA dose. So mixing these two could actually be a bit problematic and end up with somebody having a bit of trouble. So we can see that about 20% of the samples that were acquired as MDA, were MDA, and on the flip side, about 6% of MDA was actually on the flip, yeah, MDMA was MDA. And then, so what is interesting in there is that these drugs look the same, and a little bit of a difference in their effects and dose could really be the difference between somebody having a potentially good time and somebody having to use the medical services on site.
Okay, so yeah, we'll talk next about ketamine. So interesting, I mean, it's mostly as a single ingredient. The main diluents that we have found is like a sugar or MSG, monosodium glutamate, joke umami ketamine. And sometimes it's mixed with other active ingredients. So you can see sometimes with cocaine, sometimes MDMA, sometimes there's baggy mix-ups of different substances altogether. Because at the end of the day, if you see on the right, it looks like a white powder, and many drugs look like a white powder. So baggy mix-ups, if they're not labeled correctly, can definitely happen. So we can prevent people having undesired experiences. So ketamine, pretty straightforward. Next is cocaine. So yeah, again, surprising. to some, but it's not as cut or filled with things that we can detect in alarming rates. The main is inactive diluents, so things such as sugars. Phenacetin as well as like a cousin of acetaminophen, which is Tylenol, and the amounts it's in there is not super appreciable. And sometimes it's mixed a little bit with other substances as well, but that's the minority of the time. And then we have the phenethylamine 2CB. So the big log green graph is just the diluents that's used in tablets. So you can see we come across some interesting looking tablets at service. These are from the pictures we took last year. And yeah, I mean, interesting with 2CB is that it is really low dosages. So they can be in the 10 to 15 milligram amounts. So weighing, yeah, like accurate weighing and dosing of substances is really important for people. So if we can help identify the substance, they can dose accordingly. Yeah, with tablets as well, if 2CB we can identify as the active, it's still kind of a guess at how much is in there in quantity. So we always do stress dosing with people because that's a very important consideration. And just to note here, where do people get their drugs? So the blue is on-site, so people either acquire or purchase them at the festival itself, and then the purple is off-site, so people bring their substances in, and then it's kind of broken down by substance. So you can see at the top, the 5-MeO-DIPT is typically bought on-site for people, same with ketamine, 2CB, and then as we go down, people usually bring in, well, not usually, but more likely to bring in their MDMA and cocaine and stuff. So kind of an FYI, but 65% of all drugs were acquired at the festival.
Okay, so now we're gonna compare where the drugs come from and the expectations, the result of expectations versus the result of drug checking. So in this little chart here, we've got the drugs that were brought on site, sorry, and that were brought to the drug checking service. 91.6% of them tested as expected. So that means if you actually had brought your MDMA and you had an ingredient that says you got MDMA and then maybe a bit of sugar, we consider that if there's a bit of sugar, it still tests as expected. So you'd have about like 91.6% of them. However, if you were buying your drug outside of the festival site, you would go down to about like 87.3. And that is interesting. It means that if you acquire your drug at the festival, according to the drugs brought to our drug checking service, you are 4 or 5% more likely to get something that does not contain other active ingredients. So now we're going to compare this with the service access. So if the drug is acquired on site, there is, and just from the stuff that's brought to the drug checking service, right? So again, like there might be people that actually don't care about drug checking and won't bring their drugs. So we can't know what everybody does at the festival. But for stuff that is brought to the drug checking service, about 86% decided to test their drug before using at the festival site, right? And if it was outside, then it was only 61% actually tested their drug before using. So this might be due because outside of the festival, there is not as much access to drug checking. Obviously, the drug checking operation at festivals like Shambhala and Base Coast is a pretty extensive affair, and people actually go to the festival and look forward for that. So we can see there's a 40% increase in drug checking access if the drug is actually acquired at the festival. So I just want to compare this quickly with this, which is I find interesting is that if people buy the drug outside of the festival site, we often hear anecdotally people say like, oh, I would never buy a drug from a stranger at Shambhala. Well, the matter of fact is that you're more likely to get a drug that is what you expect if you buy it at Shambhala, because the pressure that drug checking places on the market adds accountability. Drug checking has been there, for example, at Shambhala for 20 years now. And we believe that it's a lot harder to actually get away with selling stuff that is not what it's supposed to be. Okay, now we're just going to look at what drugs actually look like. So this is a very colorful, pretty example of the drugs that come through our drug checking service. Unfortunately, I would say it's not representative. Most of what we get is actually powders and crystals. So white powder, white crystals, clear crystals, that's basically all there is. And they all look the same. Probably that's why we actually need drug checking to differentiate them. But all that to say that about 1 out of 5 of the drugs that come through come in the form of a pre-measured unit. So that could be a blotter for LSD or a tablet or a capsule. So these pre-measured units mean that it is expected that there would be a dose that is pre-calculated in there. As we know, it's not always the case. There are tablets that contain way too much or way too little of the active ingredient, and that causes problems. But for the rest of the bulk substances, people have to actually measure their doses because we know that is probably the main factor after knowing what your drug is that will influence your experience. Now, I'm not going to dive into that. You have the report if you want to see it closer. Just to say that actually tablets often come in a mix. So you'll have, let's say, an MDA tablet will have often caffeine in it at the same time. So it's pretty easy in tablets to mix drugs together.
All right, and just to briefly touch on when people test. So majority of people, about 2/3 of people test before they use, which is good because if you have that information, maybe that can influence your decisions. And about 1/3 test after they use. Sometimes people have a funny experience and they come to the drug checking and they're like, what was it? And more often than not, we confirm the identity of the substance that they're expecting. So it's funny that yeah, sometimes drugs can have different effects than people expect, and due to all the factors Antoine went over. And then unknown drugs. So about 1 in 10 of the time, there's people bring in unknowns or ground finds. So these are substances maybe that people had laying around somewhere, or they were gifted, or the label fell off or was rubbed off, or they, yeah, there's all myriad of reasons, but about 1 in 10 samples are unknowns. And interestingly, and maybe not surprisingly, about 90+% of the time people test it before using, and about 5%-ish is they do their own bioassay on an unknown substance, which we do not encourage. So yeah, interesting little stat there.
Okay, so just going quickly here, we're towards the end of the presentation. Just going beyond drug checking. So the service, as we said earlier, is part of it's a holistic approach to harm reduction. So there's many other services on site. And we go beyond individual messaging. While this remains the goal to provide an individual with information about their drug, we do have ways of communicating trends and concerning results to a broader population. So at festivals, we've got something called the info screen, which you can see in the bottom right picture. We also have access to festival communication systems. So if there was something really concerning at one point, places like Shambhala and Base Coast have text messaging in place that they can send messages to all the attendees at once. We could even ask them if it was a real emergency to have the artist shout out something on the mic. And then another important thing that we do is inter-team exchange of information. So that means we discuss our results with medical, with the sanctuary, which Jared will tell you about. And we also get information from them, right? So if they have somebody presenting with some condition of drug toxicity, they can bring the drug if they can obtain it, and then we can analyze it to see if it relates to the symptoms that they are presenting. So this is an example of the info screen. It basically shows that we use the screen to give out harm reduction information. So you've got 2CB here, which has actually ketamine MDMA, which is totally different drug. You've got just cocaine itself, which actually tested as cocaine, and then we give out harm reduction information about that. So that's a screen that's really popular at the festival site. A lot of people like to stare at it for a while, and they can actually bring it with them through their phone, but in the efforts of privacy for the experience there, we're not sharing that here.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, beyond the drug check. So drug checking, as Antoine was saying, is not a standalone service. So we're integrated with other things. And it's not just about drug checking. So, we hand out harm reduction supplies at the tent as well. So you can see at the bottom right in that picture. So safer use drug equipment. So that means maybe individual snorting straws for people so they're not sharing things to increase hepatitis C transfer. Hand out condoms, hand out earplugs because it's really loud out there, and just trying to protect people's ears. And also on site at festivals is medical services. So if people, simply have a cut on their foot or scrape, they can go and get patched up there, or some more serious conditions, or even childbirth has happened at festivals. So they're quite equipped and knowledgeable, excellent team there. And then there's sanctuary, crisis intervention. So if people are having an overwhelming experience, or just need a place to kind of be quiet and calm down for a little bit. Sometimes medical passes it off to sanctuary, but people can just rest, relax, be supervised by someone who's trained to kind of just be nurturing to them. And then there's outreach, so people with the festival staff that kind of go in the crowd and make sure all is well, and kind of just check in on people. There's the safe spaces if people need to talk to someone or have a conversation. Security, so this is tied to safer policy implementation. So festivals are, their policies are not punitive, so they're more supportive. So same with security for the most part, is people are knowledgeable of what's happening at the festival. It's almost like a supervised consumption site in a sense, and people are just trying to keep people safe and have positive time. So everyone is kind of on that, which is good. And then environmental context planning. So this means things having good access to water, having shade structures, access to toilets and outhouses and things like this. So that's all. These are all the ways that festivals kind of care for its patrons and keep people safe to have positive experiences. So drug checking is kind of just one of them. Yeah, so just putting your guys' attention towards additional resources. So there's the Interior Health Drug Checking website, drugchecking.ca. They have a lot of excellent resources and things. The infographic is also accessible there if you missed the link. The BCCSU drug checking dashboard is very interesting. They have drug checking results all across BC put into there, and they have a searchable, filterable database that you can search by year, location, color, drug type. It's really cool. Substance at the University of Victoria here on Vancouver Island is really great. They put out monthly reports that are exceptional, and they have access to some pretty cool instruments. So I highly recommend checking that out. And then there's the DREAD project, so dreadproject.ca. That's where the drug checking manual exists. So yeah, if you're curious to learn more, that's a good place to go. And yeah, just it's not an exhaustive list of all the resources that are available throughout BC, and then there's many throughout Canada as well. So do some Googling. But yes, thanks you everyone for listening. Thank you Parachute for having us. And yeah, we're happy to answer any questions you guys might have.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Antoine and Jared. That was a really interesting and clear presentation. Thanks so much. I'll pass over to you, Stephanie, now to take our Q&A. I think we had a couple questions submitted ahead of time, if I'm not mistaken. I'll pass to you, Steph.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Antoine and Jared. I know that I learned a lot from your presentation, so that's wonderful. Yeah, we'll start with a question that a participant submitted on registration. So they said, I would love to hear your strategies on communicating results and harm reduction messages when you have a non-conclusive analysis. For example, if you don't only find cellulose and nothing else in a sample.
Yeah, I can answer that one. So it does happen, and in this report, we did not accurately represent that. However, it happens less than expected. It's surprising how I think we had about like maybe 20 instances of that or so for this report. Usually, it really is a communication about the fact that we don't find something doesn't mean that there is nothing in there. So typically when we don't find anything, we actually advise the person to be very careful, actually more careful than if we would actually identify something. Typically, we're pretty good at identifying stuff that is very potent and potentially dangerous like fentanyl. But in certain drugs, there could be certainly other things that we might be missing out. So in the context of the festival, I would say that if we do not identify the active, we urge the person to proceed with lots of caution. because we don't know. So tips would be like start with a very small amount, like take the amount that you think would be small and cut it in 4, and then take that amount first, and then just like see if that makes you feel something, and wait like more than an hour for that to happen, and then maybe decide if you want to do it again. However, I will say that we are lucky a bit in the case of festivals that most of the attendees go there with like a big budget. They look to buy drugs and use drugs. And one of the recommendations that recommendations, I mean, one of the things that we are actually able to say that sometimes is that if somebody buys a drug that doesn't come up as they expect it to be, there, as we can see with the data, there are drugs that are as expected at Shambhala. So we usually encourage people to try to pursue the experience that they were looking for and not change their behavior because of a drug checking result. So let's say you bring MDMA and that's what you wanted to take, but instead you have 2CB. Well, we're not going to tell you not to take it, but we're also going to tell you like, hey, like you were looking to have an MDMA experience, like you probably could still focus on trying to make that happen instead of using a drug that you don't know much about.
And just to add to that, like Nuria was asking, what do you do when there is you can't identify it? So if we have a drug sample and maybe there's like, you know, with FTIR, there's a spectra that you interpret and you can see kind of what's going on, and you have like a certain level of confidence of what the ingredients are. If there's something going on where it's unusual, or there's something unidentifiable, or it's just strange, like Antoine was saying, like majority of the time it's not a head scratcher. It's pretty straightforward of like confirming identity. Yes, this is that. But when it is an unknown or unusual, we can encourage people to discard their samples and find something else. We have discard bins so people can get rid of the sample if it's unusual or not expected. So we encourage that as opposed to people just discarding it in the garbage or back at camp or something, because then someone else will pick it up. But yeah, that's if people are expecting a really regular substance and it's an unusual result, like why would you take that chance?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you both. And we have a lot of questions flooding in, which is wonderful. And just to let participants know, anything we can't get to in the next few minutes, we will work with Antoine and Jared to get some answers that we'll send in follow up, because there's some lots of great engagement here. Yeah, so thanks for segueing into the question about what you do with samples in those unidentified cases. In terms of the results that you find, are there kind of established processes or channels that you share those results with? You know, someone's asking about whether those results are shared with the Poison Center, or are there, specific channels to share this information for situational awareness? And if not, maybe the network can help.
Well, I can take a crack at that. So we presented on drug checking in festivals, and drug checking in festivals is a bit insular to drug checking in communities, where there are a lot more models in place to actually share information with practitioners of like people who work in all kinds of areas, and peers as well, because they are the #1 concern with drugs, right? So at festivals, we have a system in place where we have daily huddles with the medical team and other teams, and we exchange information like that. But there is no specific channel of communication where we access the results and share like every specific result. We mostly share our trends like word of mouth kind of thing. But everybody has also access to our info screen, and whatever is concerning usually ends up on this info screen.
Great, thank you. And yeah, thank you for all of the context around what the data do and do not represent. We know that's so important, and it's important with Poison Center data as well. So that's really helpful. But you know, it all can help create the pieces of the full picture when we put it all together, right? There's a couple questions related to sort of the impact of drug checking and the information given on user behavior. So is this something that you're aware of at all? Is it something you observed kind of collect anecdotal reports on. Do you look at that, or are there any comments you have on how the information provided might impact users?
Yeah, I mean, we do collect that kind of some information like the discards as well, but it's hard because there's a lot we would love to do, but a lot of the work is done here is volunteer basis. A lot of the training happens in a short amount of time, so we try our best with what we have. But yeah, I mean, a lot of anecdotal evidence of people being helped and supported in things. For example, I see Manuela do you come across instances in which there are toxicity interaction with drugs of misuse and medication in people with chronic diseases? So people are coming up to the tent and asking questions about interactions with their prescribed medications, interactions with their chronic disease states, and can I take MDMA if I have diabetes? And these are interesting, very interesting questions. And as a pharmacist, like I know there's not a lot of medical reference. Not a lot of medical references comment on these things, but with the new literature coming out, especially with MDMA and ketamine as prescribed medications, there will be a lot more evidence towards answering these types of questions. So yeah, I mean, just lack of time and resources, but we would love to kind of put together more of this and collect this type of data because I think it's, we all think it's quite valuable.
I want to add to that. Thanks, Jared. Just a reminder, and probably the biggest challenge of actually investigating that data is that drug checking is in its essence, it's a very anonymous service. It's always been a core of the service. So we are not really able to collect data on individuals. Sometimes during the interaction, people will voluntarily blurt out information like, hey, I'm on NSSRI. How would this make you feel if I take 2CB? But we're not asking for these questions, and we're not collecting any data on that. The only data that relates to the person that we collect is if they've actually used a substance before and how that make them feel. And that's it. That's really the only thing. The rest is all about the drug that they bring.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, there's always a balance between information we can collect that's helpful, but also respecting that first and foremost, it's about keeping people safe and harm reduction. And so balancing what we want to collect for our purposes, but also creating a safe and trusting relationship with those who use the service to that end. So unfortunately, we're out of time for the Q&A. Thank you all so much for submitting your questions. And as I mentioned, we will provide more responses in our follow-up message to all participants. Sarah, do you want to take us home?
Absolutely. Thanks, Steph. Thanks, Antoine. Thanks, Jared. As Steph said, we will be sending out follow-up information. So look forward to that. Thank you for coming today. Have a great day, everyone.